Okay, I think we are going to start this session, and hopefully people will also continue to trickle in from lunch. This is another super important subject. It has to do with AI in the digital information realm and how we enhance the quality and diversity of information. We will have a special focus on the UNESCO Rome Framework, which stands for rights, as in human rights, openness, which is a multi-varied concept that will be explained, access, and multi-stakeholder engagement, Rome. And the segment will be led by Banu Nupani, who's a program specialist in communication and information from UNESCO. UNESCO is just known to be a leader in the information realm generally. And in fact, you might want to say a word about UNESCO's mission. But I think we're also going to start with a presentation about the Rome framework itself as a grounding place, and then we're going to learn more about how AI is affecting that framework and whether it needs to be changed. So with that, Banu?
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, everyone. For question and answer, there is Pigeonhole is available. So if you come up with any brilliant answer or comment, please send that to us so that we can take that into consideration. I've got a very august set of panelists here. What is UNESCO? And that's where I start. UNESCO with its partners has a mandate of building peace in the minds of men and women. It's as part of human family through its work in education, science, culture, communication, and information. We also believe that a knowledge society is a peaceful society, a society in which knowledge is a force of changing society, and a society which provides universal and equitable access to information. But technology, as we see it today, is changing it all. It is changing the way we generate, share, access, and use information. Information production is no longer centralized within the realm of traditional generators, as everyone today is a content creator. The dissemination of information has found quicker and democratic avenue in social media platforms. Universal access to information is empowering people to hold their government accountable, access educational resources online, and transfer and validate knowledge in a seamless manner. But our engagement with information has also created new realities. These realities arise from the fact that technology change is neither additive nor subtractive, but it is ecological. And I take you back to Neil Postman's famous saying that ecological in the sense that the change has brought total change in the system. It's like putting a red dye in a bucket of small, glass of water. Entire water becomes pink. So everything changes with that drop of water. Artificial intelligence as a general purpose technology is no different. This is therefore takes us back to the century-old Orwell and Huxley debate, where the two writers were present in presenting two versions of the future. Sadly, both exist today as we discuss the changing nature of information in the AI age. Digital platforms are influencing the way we produce and share information. The speed and the reach of disinformation is influencing elections and democracy. They say that India's election, which recently held, there were about 2,300 AI, and I'm not, I'm quoting these figures from some social network, that I found. 2,300 AI strategists were involved. I do not know what they were doing, but of course, they must have changed how the result finally shaped in India. UNESCO's upcoming publication, Steering AI for the Knowledge Societies, provides a framework for analyzing of the changes taking place in societies from the rights, openness, access, and multi-stakeholder perspective. And we had launched this and now adopted by the member states as a framework to guide how internet should be, must be accessed around the world. If I essentially take you through this presentation, the internet access must have certain human right implication. Openness and AI is a key because knowledge, data, market, as well as opportunities will be guided by the AI, the way it is being utilized. Inclusive access for AI development will also become a key, and multi-stakeholder approaches in AI governance will also drive how this technology will be adopted or accepted by the society at large. And there are certain cross-cutting issues such as AI and gender, as well as how AI will shape the future and development of Africa. In this context, we will be discussing a few key challenges, and in fact, these key issues are, how, from the rights perspective, how the freedom of expression, right to power, privacy, or right to equality will be impacted by AI. We have also captured certain institutional standards, that will be shaping how AI will shape the rights in the days to come. And we have also developed certain, we have shown the need to develop certain guidelines based on human rights risk and influences around AI. We also have seen the same AI from the openness point of view, in which we have examined how transparencies around AI will shape its use around the world. How will open data will shape its uses, and open and pluralistic market, and how it will lead to foster innovation around the world. We also have provided certain options around this, and we have also examined how access to AI research will change. And you may know that there has been about, they call it a 6,000% increase in AI publication in the recent time. If we take the from 2007 to 2017 data, which is quite high. And we also have seen how access to connectivity, hardware, and access to data will shape how information will be treated or mistreated in different parts of the world. We also have provided certain policy options around access and AI. And finally, we have moved on to talk about multi-stakeholder dimension of AI. We have got a set of eminent panelists here, and who will be, and I'll be introducing them to you, and I will be asking certain questions. And what we want from the panelists is, we are almost on the verge of coming out with the publication. We still, the publication is almost on the press, but still we have got time to attach a few options to this one. And then, we will be requesting from this one. The primer of this publication is available. It has been distributed to most of you, and copies of that is also outside. There are 4 people, who have contributed to this publication, and it includes Lucia, who's sitting there, and myself, and Xiang Hong, who's another colleague, and Pratik Sibal. So 4 of us, have put together this document, and this document is already in the press. But we want this panelist to provide us with certain options to take the discussion slightly forward. I have got Kathleen Shiminu. She's the head of data sciences and she's Africa's talking and co-founder of Nairobi Women in Machine Learning and Data Science Community. I have got Nick Brotza, who is head of Cortex Ventures, which is Africa's first AI-only focused venture capitalist fund. Francesca Rossi, she's from Italy and now heads the IBM AI Ethics Global Leaders. Nigel Hickson is with us. He's the vice president, and he's responsible for IGO engagement at ICANN. And we have got Fritz Bussmaker. He's the chair of Institute for Accountability in the Digital Age. The first question that I will be, this question will be for everyone, and you have got 3 minutes to respond to this question. How AI is impacting freedom of expression, right to privacy, right to equality, and what action needs to be taken for the safeguarding of these rights in the digital age? And I start with Kathleen.
Thank you, Banu. Sorry, will you please repeat the question again? Pull up the slide. You started with I was not prepared for.
The questions are long, I'm sorry. How AI is impacting freedom of expression, right to privacy, and right to equality, and what actions need to be taken for safeguarding these rights in the digital age?
Thank you. Okay, sorry, I'm a bit nervous. Okay, so AI has changed a lot of things, right to privacy, right to access. We're now in a world where, we're talking about this in the morning, we're now in a world where you don't exactly own the data about yourself. Yeah, it's a very blurry line as to who owns the data about yourself. Is it you? Is it the company that is monetizing it? I'm sorry, can I answer after
what I will
else?
do is then I will ask Nick to take this question.
Okay, I mean, I'm an English guy with an Irish passport living in Africa, and I've been there 8 years. So my perspective is really based on what's happening in Africa with things like government policy. There isn't much. I think it's the AI for Dev community just released the 2019 AI Government Readiness Survey, which I encourage everyone to have a look at, on AI for Dev. And obviously, from a policy perspective, African governments are still some way behind. I think the Kenyan government is probably leading the way on policy with AI and things like blockchain in the region. So at the mega level, I think policy helps drive things like human rights in any domain. But then down at the individual level, I mean, GDPR is something that exists in Europe. We have a fairly fragmented privacy policy across Africa. In South Africa, they have POPI, which isn't fully implemented as yet. And it is, as Kathleen said, a very grey area. You know, if you use Facebook, we all know that our information was recently abused with Cambridge Analytica. But if we can tap into African genome and health data, we might be able to solve some groundbreaking grand challenges in Africa. So there's always this balance, I think, between privacy and can we make impact. And in the absence of government policy, you'll probably not achieve as much as you could in a short time when AI is evolving at an exponential rate. So it's quite a complex subject to answer in 3 minutes. So.
Okay, I'll ask, Francesca.
Sure. Yeah, so in terms of human rights, I mean, to address this question, maybe a little bit, at the general level, I would like to bring my experience in the European Commission high-level expert group on AI, where we really, in order to get to a very concrete requirements for the kind of AI that we want in Europe, we started from a human rights perspective. And we said, let's look at the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights. Let's see which ones are relevant for AI and how AI is going to impact our lives, and let's start from there. So we started from these rights, then we went to very high-level principles, and for example, the principles, these 4 principles that we identified are the human autonomy, and agency, the prevention of harm with AI, the right to fairness, no discrimination, everybody should be treated equally, and of explanations in terms of the technology. And then from these very high level 4 principles that are very related to explicit rights in the Charter of Fundamental Rights, then we said, okay, let's make them much more concrete, and we listed 7 requirements coming from these 4 principles that every AI product, every AI embedded product in Europe should have. And we called it trustworthy AI. And so we went from this very high level principle to these 7 requirements that again are human oversight and agency, robustness and safety, privacy and data governance, transparency, fairness, diversity and inclusion, societal and environmental well-being, and accountability. And so the idea was, I think it's a very good example, not of the specific requirements that maybe can be slightly different in various parts of the world, but of the fact that we went from this high-level human rights discussion to very concrete recommendations. And I think that more and more we should see this passing from very high-level guidelines and principles to very concrete requirements for the kind of AI that we want to see.
Thank you, Francesca. Nigel, can I ask you this, primarily, from your perspective of your relationship and association with UNESCO for a long time, how is AI impacting freedom of expression? Just that, very simple. I just cut it down.
Not at all. Is that enough, or do you want more? No, sorry. Well, first of all, it's delighted to be here. Well, actually, I live in Geneva, so I'm not delighted to be here, but I'm I am, but I'm delighted to be at this. I better not say any more. I'm delighted to be at this conference, and it's always nice to work with UNESCO. I worked with UNESCO for a number of years, and I was just thinking that if there's any organisation at all that should be asking these questions and should be doing work in this area, it is UNESCO. What they've done in terms of humanizing the internet, looking at internet governance, looking at the social impact of the internet, looking at the economics, looking at the cultural aspects of the internet has been, I think, really far-reaching. And it's the same with artificial intelligence. I came into this technology area ages ago. We were told 20 years ago that the internet was technical, that we didn't really have to worry as policymakers, that we didn't really have to worry as social scientists and other sort of applications of the internet. It would all be done by business and the technicians. Don't worry, my dear, the internet will be fine in the hands of technicians and business. And we know it hasn't been. It's the same with artificial intelligence. Yes, we need the innovation, we need the passion, we need the energy, but we also need to reflect, we also need the UNESCOs of this world, we need the social scientists, we need the collaboration, we need the government policy makers to see what is going on. And in terms of freedom of expression, in terms of human rights, it's no different. So there's 3 steps that I think have to be taken in this area. First of all, there has to be a recognition. We have to recognize the impact of human rights. We have to acknowledge that human rights has an impact on artificial intelligence, or artificial intelligence has an impact on human rights. We then have to analyze what that impact is. And although unfortunately I wasn't here for the keynote speeches, but several people have told me that the keynote speeches yesterday morning were groundbreaking in many ways, because here we had the captains of industry, which you wouldn't have had 3 or 4 years ago at this summit, actually talking about ethics, talking about principles, talking about the same thing that we're talking about here. And I think that's very important. So secondly, recognition, and then thirdly, doing something about it. And this is where the M in the Rome statement comes in, doing something about it in a multi-stakeholder framework, which we'll say a bit more about later. Thank you.
Thank you.
Let me try and salvage myself. So from a human rights, on the topic of human rights, I wonder if we can think about it from a citizen perspective, because what I find back home especially is that there's there's a lot going on, which when I look at it, is just looks like ploys by the government to collect data on people. And a good example is an initiative that the government is currently running. It's called Huduma Number, and it's portrayed as an attempt to give each citizen a single identifiable number, much like the case with India that we're discussing this morning. And in as much as it is not mandatory, so it's optional. You could get it or you could not get it, but the government is literally bullying people, let me put it like that, with the premise of denying them government services. And the overall effect is that people are going to sign up for this number, but they're not aware of the implications. Where the country is right now and where most African countries are, there are no data protection rights. So, and the government is not the custodian of this data at the end of the day. So there's a lot of questions which, as the citizens of the country, we're trying to ask, but then all we get back is threats. So from a citizen perspective, I think educating the masses would be very important. Because at the end of the day, for example, when I talk to my mother and I tell her that I don't want to sign up for this initiative, she approaches it from a point of protecting me. It's going to be hard for me in a couple of years, perhaps, if the government does follow through with some of these threats. But from my perspective, I see it as a threat. I'm scared for my data. I'm scared for the fact that a lot of people are signing up for this, and the government does not necessarily have control of this data. So I think educating the masses and just empowering them to know that in as much as the government is the government, the people should be the ones that dictate what the government offers us. And also just freedom of choice. If we can end up in a world where AI is pervasive and no one can fight that, but it would be nice if I had a choice, if it was explicit that in this instance, as you are maybe scrolling through your Facebook feed, this stuff is curated to you because you chose X and Y and Z. And Netflix they make recommendations and they tell you we're recommending these shows because you watched this other show. So can you get to a point where you're given the option to say, okay, stop recommending or stop using my previous choices to just give me recommendations. I'd like to, I don't know, explore the big wide world for myself. And then from a freedom of expression standpoint, it's true that we now live in a world where you no longer go to, for example, the New York Times to get your news. Everyone has a platform. Everyone can be a source of news. So it becomes a complex situation to verify what is true and what is not. But then from the other tail end of it, I work for a company that is mainly a communication service provider, and something that we struggle with is screening messages. So at election time, it's normally a very charged situation because tribes are pitted against each other, and then there's sometimes post-election violence. And some of this violence is cited via text messages, which we have an infrastructure that sends text messages. And a problem we have is the fact that it's easy to screen messages that are in English, but then these messages are not going to be written in English, because if you're inciting a tribe, you're going to use their mother tongue. So in as much as freedom of expression has grown, and we're now thinking about developing systems that can maybe moderate conversations, there's still a dearth of tools that does this for the tail-end languages, the minorities. So just thinking about that and consider AI and how industry is regulated.
Thank you, Kathleen. Brett, you have a small video to show, I guess.
Yeah, I think it's a good time to show that video. I'll wait for that video, then explain the context.
Curtains, lights, doors. It even unlocks my car. And the only one with access is me.
Hi guys, I hope you get the point. Yeah, because we love to talk about technology. The one thing we forget to do, and I hope it works, is who is accountable when something goes wrong. I think that's the key question here, because if you want to protect human rights, you also have to protect the technology, which is potentially disrupting those digital rights. So it's a video from a Dutch insurance company, which is referring to a lot of the Big Apple presentations. Most of the time it works, but sometimes it doesn't work. Then we have to do something about that. And I'm actually also the vice chair of the outreach committee of this summit. And in the 3 years I've been involved in helping to organize this, I want to follow Nigel's lead. I'm extremely impressed that yesterday's morning keynote indeed, for the very first time, acknowledged not only talk about technology, but also talk about the principles to make it happen. Like accountability is one of the fundamental principles. But there's something else going on. I want to share this with you. This is a quote from Admiral Michael Rogers, the current director of the NCA in America. And this is also why the world is changing. Because the way we used to solve these problems in the past, let's organize a legal and standards framework to contain this. Technology is moving too fast for that. I'm assuming we're off the record, by the way. Yeah, we're doors closed. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay. I'll share with you. A couple of weeks ago, I had the honor to meet Newt Gingrich. He was in the Netherlands, the former Speaker of the House. So I asked him, "What's your advice, and what would your advice be in this digital age? How are we going to deal with accountability?" So he thought for a second, said, "Oh, well, just like the steam engine. That was disruptive technology. And when the steam engine came to us, we needed to do something about it. And it took us about 20 years to help organize that. In principle, in concept, he's right. But he completely missed the point why it's so different. We don't have those 20 years. So we have to think of other ways to control technology, deliver what we want it to do. So, small commercial break. That's also actually at the instigation of UNESCO 2 years ago. We set up the very first summit in The Hague, a summit for accountability in a digital age, to bring a global multi-stakeholder community together to discuss not only how can we improve rules and regulations and framework, but also how can we start to develop 21st century instruments to start to manage this same technology. So use AI to manage AI. Maybe we use other technologies, because we're at an age, at a point where we really need to do that if we want to contain and keep those human rights.
Thank you, Fritz. Let me ask Francesca, how is openness and transparency are being influenced by AI in the digital?
Okay, so openness, the various discussions that I have around the various list of principles or guidelines for AI and to make it beneficial or safe or respectful of human rights. Openness comes up in two ways, I think. One is to make sure that there is access for technology, and in that, I mean, the companies are working in that direction. So, for example, at IBM, but also in other companies, we develop tools to fill the skill gap to help to make it easier to develop AI solutions and neural network models and so on. But then openness also comes in the sense of open source, of making some platforms, some core capabilities available to everybody, so that there can be scaling. This morning I was in a session about scaling AI for good, and we all agreed that an open platform with core capabilities is the right way to scale these projects that right now are mostly customized and ad hoc, and every time we start from scratch for a new project, while an open platform where everybody can contribute will really help the scaling of these AI for good projects. But then also it comes up in helping developers, which are those that build the AI solutions, understand, in terms of open source again, understand what are these issues, what is the issue of bias and fairness, what is the issue of explainability, all these various properties that we want to inject in the technology, and help communities of developers understand about these issues. So, for example, at IBM we developed an open source toolkit where everybody can go online and share code and find guidelines, tutorials about fairness. So that, because fairness seems like a very simple thing, you know, but recently, like somebody gave a tutorial that there are with 21 different definitions of fairness, meaning that depending on the context, you have different things. So you really need to brainstorm together to understand what it means. And then it also comes, as you mentioned before in your presentation, comes up in the dissemination and the openness of the scientific results. So, for example, until a few months ago, I was editor-in-chief of one of the main AI journals, the Journal of AI Research, which is completely open source. Nobody has to pay to access to those articles published there. And also the main AI conferences like IJCAI, the International Joint Conference on AI, are completely open. The results that are published there, everybody can have access to that. And that's very, very important to really get everybody, you know, the whole community to understand, you know, where we are with AI. And then another thing is openness in terms of transparency has to do with the fact that the technology should be transparent, but not meaning that companies should release the data or the algorithms, which may be proprietary, but companies should be open about the design choices that have been made in producing that technology, so that when the product is released, it is deployed, given to the client knows exactly what are the capabilities and limitations of that technology. And without that information, it's not easy for the company producing or for the client deciding or not to adopt that technology. It's not easy to understand whether there are use cases that are more or less appropriate for that technology. And this is very important because if you use the technology in some context that is not appropriate for the technology, think, for example, at some AI system that has a lot of false positives, of course, you can't use it to incriminate people because you know that it has a lot of false positives, but you could use it to find missing children or something like that. So depending on this transparent information that you gather during the development process, you can understand what are the appropriate use cases of the technology, and that's very important to make sure that you're not acting on human rights.
Nigel, would you like to take the same question? Openness and transparency, how it is influencing the information sphere.
Yes, thank you very much. So, I mean, I think, you know, we can band about these words, openness, transparency, accountability, and we can all sign up to these things in principle. And, you know, sometimes it's rather too easy. I mean, if you say to someone, are you in favor of openness? I mean, you know, very few people say, yeah, actually we want it completely closed. And, you know, do you believe in accountability? Yeah, well, you know, generally. And transparency? Yeah, pretty much so. So, you know, we can sign up to these principles, but the real issue, as you've touched on, is what they mean in practice. And certainly, I am no expert at all when it comes to algorithms and so like. But if we take the sort of transparency and openness that we've been negotiating on the internet, and how the internet works, and how decisions work, and how in the domain name system we make decisions about allocation of domain names, and how all that system works and the transparency there works, and we take that over into the world of artificial intelligence and algorithms there, then I think there are some lessons. And one of the lessons is that, of course, you can't go too far in terms of intellectual property, etc. Otherwise, there'd be no business model. But if for instance, and I was trying to think of an example, and I've probably got this totally wrong, but there was a speaker yesterday that just put, one of the opening speakers, the young lady, put something about the job application market or something similar. And so if you apply for a job and you're going to an agency and you're giving all your details and you don't get the job, then surely it's right. Is there an algorithm involved? What's involved? Is it someone just reading my application form and that's it, and they don't like the color of the ink, or they don't like the way I spell, or whatever? What's involved? And you might be told what's involved. Well, we're looking at your education, we're looking at this, and we're looking at that. And that's where I think, we really do need transparency, because what artificial intelligence does, it enables so much more to be done, which in some respects is so good, in that you can take into account so many more things. So when I apply for a job, the employer is looking at some of the other attributes, positive attributes from my past, which might, help in that job application. But in the same vein, of course, they'll be looking at social media, they'll be looking at various other things. So I think what we come down to here is we have to be told exactly what sort of data sets are being taken into consideration in these applications. When you apply for a mortgage, what is the criteria you're being judged on? What other data sets are being taken into account? And this, to me, is part of the framework that needs to be developed. And part of this framework has to be developed through a multi-stakeholder process. We have to have, for the internet, we have something called the WSIS agenda. I could lecture for hours on the WSIS agenda and internet governance, but I won't, because people get very bored by it. We need something similar in this area. And perhaps, we'll be looking back in 20 years and see it started in Geneva. We'll call it something like that. But we need a framework. We need some sort of methodology, some sort of platform, some sort of process where these things can be taken into account. Sorry for waffling.
Thank you. Nick, how AI is exacerbating the digital divide or creating new dependencies in the world? And you now, live and work in Africa. And how do you think, we can analyze access to research, education, data, and hardware, and its role in increasing the digital divide? Is it because we see more programs being cooked up for Africa, but things do not change as much as they should change on the ground. So what may be the reason for it?
That's a big question. I was at a donor funding event in Mauritius the other week. I'm 49 years old, and I was the youngest guy in the room by 15 years. And I asked the question, who understands the fourth industrial revolution? And a fair few hands went up. And then I asked the question, who understands AI? And I got 2 hands. Okay, so the awareness of, I use the word patriarchal government in Africa. It's broadly male dominated. A lot of those guys have been in government all their lives, and I sense that potentially they're a little bit afraid of putting their hand up and saying, I don't understand what we're talking about here. Okay, and I say that respectfully. Equally, I think there is a willingness to learn, and we need to educate governments, all governments, not just African governments, about the implications and benefits of AI. Only the bad news headlines make it into the news, and tech reporting in Africa is fairly hit and miss. It's generally, again, negative story. AI is going to take jobs, and there's high unemployment in Africa. Youth unemployment in South Africa is something like above 58%. If you look at unemployment in Zimbabwe, I think it's 90%. So the debate around AI for many countries in Africa is like, we're talking water, we're talking jobs, we're talking basic stuff, okay? So I think part of the education for, minimizing the growing divide, because I think one of the points made in I was in the scaling AI session this morning. The one thing we can't control in scaling AI is time. Time's just slipping through our hands like sand at the moment. And that for every day that you're not educating yourself about this technology, whether you're an individual, a company, a startup, an investor, a minister, is another day where you've literally stepped backwards, not by one day, but maybe a month. And then it just keeps going and it's slipping away from you. So I think we need to educate governments about the benefits and implications of not understanding this opportunity that you're being presented with. I think the famous one is that the guy is trying to sell a machine gun to people people in a battle with bows and arrows. And they turn around to him and they say, we haven't got time to learn about the machine gun because we're too busy fighting the war with bows and arrows, okay? So stop, take time to learn what the machine gun can do, okay? Because if you don't, you'll find yourself on the wrong end of it, and then there'll be trouble. To try and bridge this gap, and I mean, it's some of the work we've been doing with the academic communities. Kathleen's part of the Deep Learning in Daba community, which evangelizes around machine learning and deep learning in Africa. It's now in 27 countries. I'm on the business side of it. We run AI Expo Africa, which is the largest business-focused AI community in Africa. And one of the things we've launched is AIAfrica.wiki. So we're trying to auto or self-curate locally a standard set of information about what's going on with AI in every African country. So there's 54 countries, and there's a standard set of headings which are gradually being populated by local people and their own understanding of what's going on. So hopefully we can start to educate government about the benefits and implications, and also provide an open resource for people to go and look at and understand just what's going on around them. I think some of the people have no comprehension of how large Africa is as a continent. I'm lucky enough to have driven across it. It took me a year. And I think impediments to development and understanding around the opportunity, I mean, for the event that Kathleen and I were at in Nairobi earlier this year, the guy from Burkina Faso had to take 3 flights to go to Nairobi. He had to get a visa, etc., etc. There's so many impediments to preventing the divide from getting bigger in Africa. And actually some of the solutions to those impediments are quite simple. You know, if donor funding could create a travel grant pool of funding or something like that for entrepreneurs, that would be great. So I think there's lots of things we can look at. It's not too depressing. There is innovation happening. But for me, it's all about education, really, at the end of the day.
Cassie, you will be in a... Say, for example, you deal with a bunch of startups, I guess. And are there resources available, data accessible, educational facility available, trainings available, and so forth?
Before I get to startups, so I attended a session much like this at the last Indaba in 2018, and the moderator began by making us do an exercise. So we all stood up, and this was a gathering of, say, 550 people from, I think, 33 African countries plus 19 countries from the rest of the world. And so with the exercise, we all stood up, and then every time she said something and you fitted the description, you had to sit down. So the first thing was someone who has more than 2 years programming experience in any programming language. And then several people sat down. Next was people who have an undergraduate degree. Again, another bunch of people sat down. People who have a master's degree. No, actually, sorry, if you fit the description, you remain standing. If you don't, you sit down. So not what I said at the beginning. So programming experience for more than 2 years, then undergraduate degree, then master's degree, then PhD, then has published a paper or has had a paper accepted at a leading machine learning / AI conference. And at the end of it, maybe 2 or 3 people were left standing. And the point of the exercise was just to emphasize the fact that, yes, there is a lot of work being done to bridge the gap. Africa is not a place where you go and there's several universities that offer data science or machine learning degrees. We acknowledge that. That's why there's now a summer school that is helping to bridge that gap. But also, we acknowledge the fact that when we get that gathering of 500 people from all these different countries, they're still the creme de la creme, so to speak. They're not the average African. The average African possibly is not proficient in English, possibly is not literate. So maybe it's the fact that a lot more people need to sit down and just think about how to bring someone who is not even in the digital age into the age of AI. There's this term digital native, and now we're going to be having children who are born in the age of AI and interact with it. But then there are also going to be children at that same age who have never even seen a computer, who cannot even speak English. So where do they start with learning how to use a computer? I think another thing is representation. Representation does matter. As an individual, if you watch TV and see Beyonce dancing, you're going to want to be a Beyonce because that's reachable to you. If you're a black girl and you aspire to something, that's something that someone that looks like you has done, so you aspire to it. And I don't think there's enough representation, or at least shown to young kids who want or who could grow up to be like this. So exposure and representation is a lot. I'm very thankful for opportunities like these, to come to forums like these and just see all the things that people do. It really does expand your world. Yesterday I was at the main plenary when Timnit was speaking. Timnit is one of my absolute favorite people in the world. And every time I encounter her or Ayana Howard, I think to myself, you know what, the road is long. There's a lot that I could do and I could be. And I think we need more figures like those to just motivate individuals to aspire to more. Where startups are concerned, I think it's probably the same in terms of access. We could say the resources are there and they're open to everyone, but are they open to me if English is not my first language? Are they open to me if I don't have an internet connection? Are they, open to me if I do not have access, exposure? I don't know that my business could port into something that is AI and data-driven because I'm just not conversant with these things. So again, I'd just say maybe we need more people to think about how to bring people who are not even in digital age into AI age.
Thank you so much. That's very insightful. Then I think I should be asking you, Fritz, from an accountability perspective, how do you think we can address this just in a growing chasm, those who have and those who not?
Actually, I want to answer the question also reflecting to a remark made earlier about lack of knowledge, because it's not just Africa, it's also countries like the Netherlands. We're one of the most connected countries in the world on the internet, but I also chair a local organization where we talk to members of parliament about the impact of information technology. And 10 years ago when we started, after 150 people in Dutch parliament, probably 1 or 2, maybe 3 raised their hands, yes, I know something about information technology. 10 years later, that number hasn't changed. So the people who count, who need to understand why this is important, they still aren't educating themselves what the impact is. Because today, this is a preaching to the converted discussion. We all know it's important. But the number of people out there who will really make the high-level policy decisions, they don't have a clue what's happening. But my answer would be education, making certain we actually start to talk about it. Otherwise, we're never going to solve this, because they think it's too scary. So accountable is holding Parliament accountable, get your act together, understand what we're talking.
Francesca, then is it the high-level capacity building or upstream capacity building that we should be going for, rather than talking about capacity building in the traditional sense? Like big people, policymaker, politicians,
well,
maybe they should be trained or at least to make understand what AI and data and AI ecosystem is all about.
So to give you this again, another aspect of the having the high level with the European Commission. So the first time we met, it was the end of last year. So some of us knew each other already, but most of us first time that we had met. And then we started talking, 52 people plus one person from the European Commission, just introducing what our mandate was going to be for 2 years. And while talking in this first meeting, we realized that basically there were kind of 52 definitions of AI in the room. And so besides what was our mandate, which was the first thing that we had to do, meaning to produce a document about the AI ethics guidelines in Europe, we decided to also produce another document, which was mostly educational, with a definition of AI as a scientific discipline, as a technology, to be used by policymakers and by everybody who wants to use it, to educate themselves about this discipline. Because some people thought that AI was just robotics. Some people thought that AI as a discipline was just deep learning. Some people thought that AI was just autonomous systems. So we really saw that there was a lot of lack of information about what this discipline is. And of course, we understand that we don't want policymakers to become experts in the technology, we understand, but at least they should know the current capabilities and limitations. They should not get this information just from the media, because the media give very, titles to sell or to have clicks or whatever. So education of policymakers is really very important. And because then, for example, what we are doing right now, we are making a long list of recommendations to policymakers in terms of policies, funding, infrastructure for AI in Europe, and they need to be aware of where the technology is to understand what's the right mechanism to drive that technology in the direction that we said is the right direction. So whether it's a new law or some just guidelines or certificates or auditing mechanism or agencies or best practices or standards, there are so many mechanisms that the policymakers can choose from, but if he's not educated enough, he may choose the wrong one, which can impact on innovation, on competitiveness, and of course this is not the goal. The goal is to make sure that all these properties that we want for making the technology beneficial are there, not as slowing down innovation, but actually as enabling the right kind of innovation. So, but education of policymakers.
Thank you. I would now, like to invite a couple of questions from the floor. There is. Please, you, sir.
Thanks for the panel for this remarkable exposition. I am Pavan Dugal. I am heading the Artificial Intelligence Law Hub, where we are looking at legal principles to govern the regulation and enablement of artificial intelligence at a global level. Now, today's session is primarily, and I understood it, that we have to look at how can we apply the Rome principles in the context of artificial intelligence. Now, at a time when the world is clueless on how to regulate, first of all, how to legally recognize AI as a legal entity, then how to regulate AI. Well, we have news that China has passed a new law on artificial intelligence about 3 weeks back. It's not yet published nor implemented, but the fact now remains is most of the current work is only focused on ethical principles. I want to ask the panel, what kind of a legal frameworks or legal policy or regulatory principles do we now need to keep in mind so as to make the Rome principles of UNESCO applicable for artificial intelligence? Because the applicability will present large number of challenges. How can we ensure that the entire artificial intelligence is going to be human right based? What is the minimum parameters of human rights? Because that differ from jurisdiction to jurisdiction and from society to society. And what kind of penal frameworks can we put in place? Can we put some voluntary code of conduct to be made enshrined into law, where the responsibility for applicability of Rome principles to AI could be even straddled upon the AI coders and the companies or the platforms who are using or processing or offering AI services? To the panel. Thanks.
I'm no expert in this area, but going around one of the exhibits yesterday, I noticed the guys from Deloitte, I think it's Deloitte Holland, they're working on this quality mark for AI. I thought that was quite an interesting concept. So if you haven't had a chance to see it, go and talk to the guys. I don't work for Deloitte. I'm not getting commission for recommending them. But if that kite mark or quality mark, whatever you want to call it, incorporates the kinds of things we're talking about. So has it been validated? How is the data set available for scrutiny? What is the accuracy, precision, and bias in that model? Does it comply with some soon-to-be published ICANN or UN standard or whatever? So whatever those ingredients are, it's interesting that there's someone pushing that agenda, the quality mark that can be stamped on a device or stamped on whatever, a chip, a bit like Intel inside, your AI inside, whatever that mark might be. So I just an invite, if you haven't been to their stand, go and have a look at it. I thought it was quite an interesting thing that may talk to some of your points here, which are very important.
Yes, thank you. Good afternoon. I think you're absolutely right. The one really positive thing, as we've heard, is that these discussions are going on. And there's a lot of people in a lot of countries taking forward discussions on artificial intelligence, on principles of ethics, openness, etc. So the discussions have started. Kite marks, standards, quality marks. Yes, this all again resembles, the early days of the internet, of websites, when we were trying to put some sort of quality, quality standards on the World Wide Web, etc. So this is all very positive, but we face enormous difficulties, and these difficulties are. Someone earlier said about the time. How much time have we got? Where are things going? And I think here we have to match. We have to match the innovation. We have to match the work that's going on already, and we have to match the level of ignorance, if you like, that we've also heard about that exists in so many places. And to do this, we really do need a global perspective. We need some sort of global framework, a global initiative, something to take forward, something to evangelize on the sort of work that needs to be done, on the sort of discussions that need to be had. And it's fantastic that the discussions are taking place here at the ITU. Only last week at the OECD, there were discussions in the same area. There's been discussions at UNESCO. But we somehow need to bring this together. We need to bring the users in. We need to bring the business. We need to bring the policymakers together to understand what really needs to take place.
Yeah. Second, very quick feedback, Pavan, on your suggestion. The fact that you framed the question, we need to look at the framework, legal framework, I think means you are only looking at a solution in a framework perspective, in a legal framework. I think we've come to an age that we also need to look outside that box and look at other instruments we need to develop to start to, you could say, look for accountability and maintaining all those principles. And that requires indeed a global multi-stakeholder discussion. That requires to develop tools like quality tools. Deloitte, I also want to point out a framework which PwC is looking at, demonstrating yesterday. Talk to that guy over there. Yeah, you know more about that. So people are looking at tools outside the traditional legal framework to make this happen. And that's, I think, also what we need to do.
Yes, Pavan, also to respond to your question, there are three things that is happening inside UNESCO, and UNESCO, totally owned by the member states, also in 195 countries. One of the things that has happened just a month ago is UNESCO's executive board has, in fact, given a go-ahead to establish a recommendation around ethical principle. And this ethical principle will invariably also include some of the legal, aspect of how AI should be regulated in different countries. So from December, UNESCO will, in fact, start this process. This will be very much, multi-stakeholders. Many partners will be involved in that one. And then we're still looking for, partners to drive this mechanism forward. So as we have already discussed this thing, you'll be more than welcome to join this initiative to drive it forward. Another thing that we are doing is we are trying to establish repositories of open algorithm. AI algorithm. We thought it will be a good idea to establish a repository of it where people can come they can, in fact, we will essentially provide some kind of validation to it, saying that, this AI is good, it doesn't essentially, like meddles with your privacy and so forth. So we are in a process of, creating that one. We have just now also, the executive board of UNESCO also has given a go-ahead to establish a Category 2 Center on Artificial Intelligence in Ljubljana. That is where, we also have, we will have a repository of that algorithm, developed. And we are doing it not in Ljubljana per se, but for Africa, there will be a satellite center created by Africans inside Africa, so that, that ownership will remain there. And then also some kind of, intellectual property will also somehow be addressed. UNESCO is also partnered to this global data commons, because we think that, all AI engines, is fueled by data. So there is already a process going where we are trying to establish a global data commons, where all of these data that we are talking about can somehow be, managed and created by all of us. Another question, please.
May I please tackle that question first?
Yes.
So with setting up a legal framework, I don't know how many of you would agree, but I think policy is definitely playing catch up to regulating AI and machine learning. I think in a perfect world, if society had been designed to handle AI, data would be open for all within reason. Like maybe a central repository, and then you as an organization come and give your data, but then also have access to everyone else's. But then we're already beyond that. I don't see a situation where, for example, Facebook can be convinced to make their data open in return for anyone else's. They're already too powerful. So I just argue that maybe now it's a situation of trying to leverage the small players and see if we can get the big players. But really, if data can be free and open for all, then I think the regulation would come in terms of process, purpose, and just governance of the data. Yeah.
Hello, everyone. I'm Dimitri van der Meersen from the Asser Institute in The Hague, and I have a question for the whole panel, maybe Nigel in particular, because you spoke elaborately on transparency. And my question relates to transparency, and I like this buzzword that keeps coming back, but I see a couple of structural issues relating to AI and transparency, two in particular. And one being that often the AI and the machine learning processes, especially with complex decision trees and deep learning, that the process itself is untransparent. An example of that is a project that I'm working on is called iBorder Control, and it functions basically to allocate risk scores to people at borders based on an automated data detection system. Deception detection system. The point is that they actually don't really know how the AI process comes to the risk score that it allocates. So the machine learning process itself is opaque. So they cannot really explain, because just the decision trees are too long and complex to actually give an explanation of what the AI does. And a second problem of transparency is the fact that, as we heard already a lot in the last days, that this is a $1 trillion business and still growing. So a lot of these corporations developing these AI technologies, of course, keep them extremely secretive. And that's another problem that I'm dealing with in my own research, is that if you're an academic trying to understand these phenomena and trying to make sense of them, it actually becomes very hard to gain access to how the algorithms function, because they're just legally protected for commercial purposes. And we can keep using the word transparency to try to sort of like use this liberal proceduralism to try to make our way around it. But I think both the opaqueness of AI as a sort of a meaning-making activity and the commercial interest at stake seem to just structurally impede that.
Oh, but that's for you. Oh.
You want me? Well, yeah. I mean, I think you've probably sort of identified, the real problem in this, in that, decision-making processes become more and more complex. and we just don't know, the algorithm. We don't know the criteria on what judgments are being based. And I think the border, whether someone is allowed in at the border is an example that people can relate to. So it's a very good example to use. And I'm not suggesting that one has got solutions to this, but surely one might never know the criteria that's used, the weighting that's used in terms of the decision making process, and obviously even a non AI solution can be fairly complex. But what should be clear, surely, is what inputs, what data sets, what criteria, what is being assessed here at the border. Is it just the color of the skin? Is it how high you are? Is it how you filled in that form? Whether your writing wasn't very good. All right, I'm not being trivial here, but one needs to know on the basis of how the decisions are made that the individual weighting and how it's all put together is perhaps more complex. But I think we have a right to know, what's been taken into consideration.
Yeah, so first I would like to distinguish between transparency and explainability, because I think that what you are referring to is explainability, the fact that a decision made by an AI model can have an associated explanation of why that decision was made. And that is essential, and you're right that some machine learning approaches are opaque in that respect, but I think that there is a whole scientific and research community that is working really to understand how to make them less opaque and to define different forms of explanations that can be derived from a model and a decision, even without having the training data, because sometimes when the people that are trying to put together the explanation don't even have the training data, they just have the trained model already. And the picture is even more complex because given a decision, you may want to give several different explanations to different recipients of that explanation in different terminology, with different levels of abstraction, with more or less details. So the whole space is very complex, more complex than the fairness and bias. But there are many people that are working on that. In terms of the transparency, I would not. That's why I would not call it transparency, but explainability, because transparency to me means yes, I give you the data, I give you the algorithm that I will train, but this is not going to be helpful to anybody trying to understand why a certain decision is made. So if I give you the data that the model is trained on, besides the fact that it can be proprietary, so maybe it's not feasible to do that, but I don't think it's going to be useful for the purpose of building an explanation of responding to this why question. Why are you recommending to not allowing that person? Why are you recommending that loan application has to be rejected? So in terms of responding to the why question, being transparent, meaning sharing information like data or algorithm, I don't think it's going to be, unless you have the capability to retrain it itself and then build the explanation itself. In terms of what you said about we need to understand what input we give, what feature of a person we are going to consider when we allow or not that person. Well, but that's the point. We don't give this algorithm the features. We give them a lot of data, examples of how to solve the problem, and then the algorithm by itself, while being trained with that data, understand what are the relevant features. And so that's what makes it difficult, because if you know which are the features that I give as input, then of course you say, oh no, this feature you should not consider it, then that's not okay. But the problem is that the algorithm itself finds these features, and that's the opaqueness that makes it difficult to derive an explanation, but that's also the positive fact that these algorithms can be so good and so accurate at solving problems where we don't even have the, we can't even define well the problem or give the exact set of steps, sequence of steps to solve the problem. And so that's where the machine learning comes in and says, I don't care. It doesn't matter if you cannot well define the problem. It doesn't matter if you cannot tell me all the steps to solve the problem. I will figure it out if you give me a lot of examples. And that cannot be done with the other kind of more symbolic approaches. But of course, we have to pay the price of a small percentage of error, of opaqueness, and so on. So we have to work around and trying to define explainability for this model.
Hello, my name is Grazina Ragutskaya. I'm from Oxfam Novib, and I have 2 points of observations. So first one relates to the proposal of kind of developing global regulatory framework that would cover lots of aspects of AI and many AI solutions in numerous sectors. I think it would be a very complex task, and I would rather see it as a new emerging branch of law, actually, that is required, and not only one global framework, but maybe it could be a good start. And second point, it's kind of more call. I think, when deciding on policies, we should really increase our benchmark in terms of technical knowledge and capabilities. And also, I talk about people in like decision makers, parliaments, that, and with AI, all the devil is in details. So, for instance, Francesca, you mentioned that, machine learning, that it's what you just mentioned now, it's called unsupervised learning, but there's also supervised learning way when you actually, human being is labeling certain types of data. So, it just to demonstrate you that it's very important that policymakers have technical understanding and background. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, it's an interesting point because there was another panel discussion this morning where they were advocating that they should always have a human in the loop. We shouldn't let these systems just automatically do what they do. So if you look at law, you do have a human in the loop. It's called a judge, and if you break the law or the law is broken, then the judge, you go in front of, I guess, of a human. You go in front of a human to be judged, or So I just thought that was an interesting point from another session this morning. Going back to the point about the accuracy of precision, accuracy, and bias, you can be precisely accurate and you can be imprecisely accurate. And I've been working with a technology which is a natural language generation, natural language processing engine for understanding email. And the algorithm scores itself on its accuracy of understanding the sentiment and meaning of the email that it's scoring. And below a certain score, it hands it off to a human to intervene. So I think humans are going to be involved in these systems if they're going to be effective. To let things run totally autonomously without any human intervention, I think would be foolhardy. And I think humans will work alongside these machines, but precision, accuracy, and bias, if you have no idea what's going on inside, then you probably shouldn't switch it on.
We have received 4 questions from the Pigeonhole, and I would like the panelists would like to take first question. It says both AI and human moderation decide what content is allowed or not online. What safeguards are required to ensure free speech, transparency, accountability, and redress mechanism? I think it's a bit too for account.
I can make an effort for the first one, and then my question will be, when is it disinformation?
Yeah, I'm
Oh,
the
somebody
second
recommended we go with that
second one.
Second one.
Right.
I mean, this question, I suppose you could use in. You don't need to use it in an AI context. I mean, it's a basic question about moderation and content filtering and everything else. And I mean, I think these are incredibly difficult difficult decisions. And this away from AI. I mean, these are the questions that are being asked about the current issues in terms of social media companies and how to regulate content, etc., and how to approach the whole issue of content regulation. Some of you might be aware of the Christchurch call, the call by the President Macron and the Prime Minister of New Zealand 2 weeks ago in Paris, when they addressed this problem in a paper that raised all sorts of issues and was also signed up by Facebook and other technology companies. The real issue about how you filter out content, what decisions you make, and if you ask Facebook what they do, and I'm no advocate for Facebook, and there might be someone from Facebook here, but what's so incredible about what Facebook does, and whether you like it or whether you don't like it, whether you say it's effective or not effective, is the resources involved. The human resources involved in trying to look at the content put on site is just staggering. And I think this question gets to that we are going to have to develop safeguards in the same way as AI and content. We are going to have to address these problems.
Other questions? Since the topic session is quality and diversity of information, what are the consequences of AI content personalization in human autonomy and freedom of opinion at an individual and at macro level? This is wow. Very philosophical question. I think if anyone has a PhD student, maybe this can be a very nice PhD topic to take.
I'll have a go. I mean, I could also maybe include point one here, but I mean, we're subjected to so many messages every day: television, newspapers, social media, WhatsApp. We live in a highly distracted, busy, time-poor environment where most people are angry. I mean, people don't want to be distracted anymore. I think people make personal choices about what they take in and what they don't. I think automated disinformation, I mean, we've had disinformation coming through the television since it was invented. I mean, disinformation through newspapers. I mean, if you look at some of the things like the phone hacking scandal in the UK, the newspapers were essentially running rife with people's privacy. And some of those privacy breaches had huge human consequence. So, I mean, we're very focused on AI, but we are surrounded by information, which is disinformation and fake news, or not fake news. And I think people must make personal choices about what they watch and what they don't watch. I got rid of my television 4 years ago. I just listen to the radio and choose what I want to take in, and then I'm validating myself. Maybe other people just believe what they see at face value and don't question it. So I think you have a personal responsibility to work out whether what you read and understand is real, and you should do your own homework.
There's a question, accountability.
Yeah. I'm not going to pretend I'm able to answer this question, but I'll share with you some thoughts I have when I look at these questions. And that is, when you look at safeguard or what are the consequences, I think what we want to know is based on what rules, on what principles decisions are made. So how did you come to do a particular decision? How do you decide something is disinformation or not disinformation? How do you decide, could say, to make a choice for something personal or not? I think that's the question. So understanding how it works, what we discussed earlier, making certain it's not a black box, but understanding how the black box works is what's key to start to maintain this.
One question.
Do you want a mic?
No, no.
Oh.
I have the mic.
Yeah.
Yeah. Automated. Who is aware of automated?
I just had a very quick comment actually on the topic just touched on. I think it's interesting what you say, how of course, like we always had campaigns of disinformation around us. We always had newspapers, with very particular editorial lines. So it's been around us, but maybe the change here, it's like how opaque it is and systematic. And something I discovered recently, which really shocked me and illustrates very well, is Netflix, of course, casts different movie lists for us, but the movie picture in itself is different for each user. So this is something very shocking, how, it seems very innocent, but if ever this is scaled up, and it's the case in China right now, and AI being used, to also cater the title of journal articles for each user, then this really brings it to another level, to where really actually this intersects with this question being raised on philosophy, on human autonomy, free will, self-determination, and I think this is where we're actually our possible level of understanding is not really being met there. And I think this is where we really need to raise consciousness and regulation.
I want to just build on that particular argument. We're talking about automated disinformation. So that presumes that there are standards of information and disinformation. And those are human standards. Data that's fed into the algorithm is again dependent on the human mind, of what kind of data. Because the algorithm is incapable of determining whether the information so fed is correct information or misinformation. I want to give a classical example. First week of December 2018, at the International Space Station, they opened up this AI-enabled space astronaut companion, and after opening for a short period of time, this was interacting with the astronaut, and then the astronaut wanted the companion to be quiet. To which the companion said, "You are being rude to me. Please be careful of how you talk with me." Now that forced them to shut down the companion, but the issue is, how about tomorrow if AI starts targeting humans for a cyber crime or a cybersecurity breach? Would that be deemed to be violation of human dignity? And if so, what kind of safeguards can be put in right now? Because there are now instances increasingly coming up of AI going deviant or AI going the wrong way. So in a scenario like this, what could be the way forward? Any panel thoughts?
Well, I think I said it earlier on. I mean, you just turn it off. I mean, you literally just have to turn it off. I mean, if you have any doubt as to the information that you're getting and the answers out of, say, a companion bot, if you start swearing at you, I mean, I think Microsoft's Twitter bot, they had to turn it off after 24 hours because it reflected the society around it. It pulled in all the data and it became a racist, right-wing, whatever, and they had to turn it off. So, I mean, there was a paper last year at the Deep Learning Indaba where they were struggling to get a data set to train an algorithm to identify, I think it was ID documents in one of the African countries. Because they couldn't get the training data for the algorithm, they used AI to generate training data for the AI. Okay, so they're using AI to generate data to train AI. So I mean, you could have a whole day's debate, a week's debate on that about the ethics of doing that. So now you're using a machine to generate training data for a machine. So I'll leave it for you to think about.
So thank you so much, and I think that essentially serves as almost like a concluding statement. So I would like to thank the panelists for excellent interventions and sharing their insight with us today. There were a couple of messages, that I got, which are very clear. That the respect for human rights is central to the development of AI. Openness needs to be encouraged and institutionalized when it comes to the development and deployment. Second message. The third message, that we get from this one is urgent steps are needed to be taken to strengthen access to information and AI to bridge the digital divide. And the partnership and multi-stakeholder partnership, which was repeatedly mentioned as is needed at all levels to address the challenges of AI. And I think there are a couple of questions which are still on the board, which have remained unanswered. which needs further reflection and thoughts, and maybe a couple of new PhDs. So thank you so much. You've been wonderful.
Obviously, that was a really, really challenging subject to get into the governance challenges. I have to underscore a couple of points that were also made. Just on starting with the digital divide issue, I think Kathleen, gave us a little bit of a reality check there when she talked about how many kids on the planet have never seen a computer. And, if we forget that reality, we don't understand what the real challenge is in terms of AI for good. And joining with, Nick, you said, every day people are not being educated about AI. It's not just a step backwards, it's exponential in the rate at which the digital divide is growing. And so I think that's the context for this whole conference. And then also on the governance challenges, luckily, the whole next segment is really going to get into a lot of these governance questions. I think, Fritz, you brought up the Admiral Rogers quote about the reality is our legal systems and our ethical systems are just plain outdated. And that's what your conversation was about. Several of you underscored that. But the good news, Francesca, I have to bring back, you started at the beginning saying human rights are the core commitments. At least that's what you utilized in that EU high-level panel. You also talked about new approaches to explainability have to be brought into the governance system. And last but not least, this is something very dear to our heart at Stanford Global Digital Policy Incubator, is the plea by Nigel about needing a global, multi-stakeholder approach to policy development that has to happen now, and maybe modeled on what happened in the early ICANN days and the WSIS process and all that, but that's why everybody's here. So anyway, with that, our next panel will start in about half an hour. Everybody gets a break, and we're going to be looking at human rights and human dignity in practice, and some of the governance and regulation issues. So please come back.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.